This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Rob Riches. A little bit of a special podcast episode in this portion of the week. We were on, if you follow us closely enough, you know that we recorded an episode on Sunday night with a lot of chaos and uncertainty around the Flyers. That was published on Monday morning, and a few hours later, there were two new developments with the Flyers. We'll start with the one that was more expected, because on Monday afternoon, the Flyers did officially announce that they have fired head coach Dave Hakstol after 3+ seasons with the team. So after all of this dancing and all the speculation that there was on Sunday night, this ended up being the case. Dave Hakstol is no longer the Flyers head coach. His replacement, at least for now, is Phantoms head coach Scott Gordon. He takes over in an interim role. Chuck Fletcher said he expects that this will be a 51-game audition for Gordon, that he will hold this role for the rest of the season, but did add that there are no guarantees. And then the third part was an unexpected added member to the playing roster. Anthony Stolarz suffered an injury in Saturday's game in Vancouver. He's out for 2 to 4 weeks. And folks, the future is now, it appears. Carter Hart was called up on Monday and made his NHL debut on Tuesday. We will eventually get into Carter Hart and talk about his first game. And we will get into the future behind the bench for the Flyers, first with Scott Gordon and possibly the next full-time head coach of the team down the road. But we want to start with Dave Hakstol and how this is the end of an era. He did have the third most games coached in franchise history, so he certainly has a time period that defines as his era with the team. To me, this is an era that was marred by inconsistency, by a disconnect between the players and the fan base, and ultimately by a lack of success when and where it counted. He made the playoffs twice in 3 seasons. No one can take that away, and that's great, but they never made it out of the first round. And that's where there was an issue with the performances of this team. So, Rob, I'll bring you in here on this one right now, and we'll get kind of started with some of the discussion, lots of topics tonight, obviously. How will you look back on Dave Hakstol's time with the Flyers now that we know it is officially over?
Honestly, I mean, you may remember from the last episode, Kevin, where I kind of had a bit of a soliloquy where, I kind of, went into a bit about how, I enjoyed the Dave Hakstol era. I thought that he was somebody who, when he was first hired, I mean, that was a hire that I was fully on board with. I thought that he would be tremendous as far as developing younger prospects was concerned. Honestly, I mean, I don't regard the Dave Hakstol era of Philadelphia Flyers hockey as a failure whatsoever. Obviously, he was brought in during a rebuilding period. It was something where they weren't exactly going to, they weren't exactly trying to compete to get to the Stanley Cup final, to the Eastern Conference final every year. They wanted to just kind of, put the right assets in place. They wanted to, just kind of, get ready to, set themselves up for sustained future success. Wait until the end of the Pittsburgh and Washington and Columbus eras, and just have a righteous era of Flyers hockey where they'd be able to just dominate and run the table every season. And it's something where, his it's been disputed within the past few weeks how much control over the lineup and how much control Dave Hakstol actually had. But it's one of those things where you hate to see it end the way that it did. I mean, it's one of those things that didn't necessarily end with a bang, but with a whimper, and it's something where he did what he could. I mean, he's trying to guide a bunch of younger players, a rebuilding team. It's something where he was part of Ron Hextall's big grand plan for future success and just being able to kind of run the table in the National Hockey League a little bit. And it's something where obviously, I mean, this was the year where they weren't exactly they were getting ready to take their next step. They're looking to not just sneak into the playoffs, but look like a team that belongs in the playoffs and win a playoff series. And it's something where this season it just looked like it just absolutely looked like that was not going to happen the way that they've been playing the past few weeks. And the way that I see it with Hakstol, my big gripe with him is if you watched the Flyers for pretty much all of this season and so much of last season, it just consistently, they looked like a team that just was not prepared. I mean, once the puck dropped, how many early leads did they allow in the first period this season? It's just something where it always looked like the opposition was a little bit more ready for the game than they were, and that's something that is a direct reflection on coaching. It's something where that there's only so much that the players were responding to him. I mean, it's something where a change did need to be made, unfortunately. I mean, it's one of those things where, as much as I liked Hakstol, as much as I liked his, work with younger guys and, the pedigree that he brought to the table, it's just something where it came to a pretty rough, pretty abrupt ending. And it's something where, I don't exactly regard him as a failure. I enjoyed the guy. I mean, he was surely a class guy, but I mean, it's something where a change did need to be made. It was a distraction at that point for the team once Ron Hextall was over. I mean, once Ron Hextall was fired, rather, once that went down. I mean, it's something where Dave Hakstol's days behind the Flyers bench were numbered, and it's something that needed to be done, unfortunately. But obviously, hockey doesn't always work out as planned. It is what it is, and I don't want to, just, completely fawn all over the guy and say, oh yeah, they'll miss him, they'll regret that. But it's something where, it was necessary. It was something that should have been done. And, obviously we'll see where they go from here. I am curious to see what Scott Gordon can do. I mean, he's off to a good start so far, and it's something where it's a new era of Flyers hockey. It's not one that a lot of people, I guess, expected. I don't really think anybody saw any of this coming, but that's just how it goes.
I don't think anybody saw this coming at the start of the year for sure. I think people.
Oh yeah,
It starts to build though over the course of time. You're absolutely right with the way the last few weeks went. Especially once Ron Hextall was out, and that was when that news dropped, it was pretty shocking at the time that it happened, just because it was. Normally, you don't see the GM go first. The GM's not the scapegoat, or the first scapegoat anyway, for a team's shortcomings. So for Hextall to be gone first, we learned a lot about what that kind of meant and the way that he desired the control and the ability to control a lot of aspects around the team. Now that we know that, we kind of assumed that Dave Hakstol's days were numbered, like you said. When I look back on Dave Hakstol's time with the Flyers, two things stand out to me. The first being that first season for him, because one of the things about that first season is that it was probably the worst thing that could have happened, is making the playoffs in a year where you weren't expected to. The team was really not that good when you look back on paper, and they still made the playoffs, and they turned a first round series against a team like Washington into a 6-game series, and game 6 was a 1-0 goalie duel that really came down to just which team budged first, and it happened to be the Flyers. But regardless, it was a pretty impressive series for a team that wasn't supposed to have any shot at the playoffs and was supposed to be in rebuilding mode. And what that kind of did was created expectations that Dave Hakstol was making that transition to the NHL and turning this team around faster than what it really was. So when they took a step back the following year and they didn't make the playoffs, that was a problem. Then they fell into the playoff situation again a year ago, when in reality there were two different alarming periods of last season. There was the 10-game losing streak that really told you something was wrong, and then they climb out of that. They actually, at some point in time, what did it take? About 2.5 months from the 10-game losing streak, and they held first place in the Metropolitan Division for a night. It was something as big as that. But they still slipped back through the standings from that point on, barely made the playoffs, again challenged in a 6-game series, didn't win it, and that's kind of how it goes. And then when this season started, the idea was the expectations had changed. He had to start helping this team take a step forward. And I agree with you, Rob. I think preparation was a big problem with it. I think it was one of the few things that the Flyers had some consistency in, was that they would come out and find a way to fall behind fairly quickly or give up that first goal. And look, we'll get more into Scott Gordon and the way the team played in Tuesday's game against Detroit. But isn't it an interesting concept when you come out, you play a fairly clean first period, you don't put yourself in a bad situation, you don't fall behind, you get the game's first goal, you carry a lead through the first period, you get the lead back in the second period, you carry it through the second period, you held the lead for almost the entire game. or you at least played scoreless for a chunk of it and then got the first goal and never trailed following it. What a concept, what a strategy, play from ahead instead of playing from behind. It can change the way a game goes, and it can change the way you play instead of having to chase the game constantly. And I felt like the Flyers were just chasing the game way too much with Dave Hakstol. It was never quite all put together the way that it needed to be all put together, especially this season. So I look back, that's one thing I look back on. Go ahead, Rob.
I have said before, but I think it's worth reiterating that I do think that one of Dave Hakstol's biggest shortcomings, actually two of his biggest shortcomings, were just the fact that what you do when you coach in college as long as he had. I mean, you're working with, for all intents and purposes, kids. It's something where you're able to motivate kids, especially these kids that are hungry, these kids that have a dream. They want to make it in the NHL someday. You're able to motivate these kids fairly easier, and it's something where you have a constant turnover. You have players leaving at the end of each season, and a new crop of freshmen coming in at the start of the next season, and it's something where you're able to kind of repeat the same things year in, year out, and it's something where that something like that doesn't necessarily translate to the National Hockey League level, where you have guys that are going to be sticking around for a little bit, and it's something where at some point you're playing in the National Hockey League. You're a grown man, pretty much, and it's something where what works to motivate. You have people that are on different emotional planes, and people that are just at different maturity levels than college students are. It's a lot different to motivate them, and it's something where that's something he was never really able to adapt to, and it's something where it was a lot easier for guys to tune him out. Especially this season, and it's something where you also have the National Hockey League. It's the premier league in the world for it's easy to. It's not a stretch at all to say that you're going up against superior competition night after night. No matter it may look like you're facing a first place team in the standings versus a 31st place team in the standings. It's something where you have these guys are all premier athletes. I mean, where you're coaching in the college hockey ranks, as competitive as college hockey can be. It's something where the talent level, there's still such a disparity from different, across different college programs than there is in the NHL. And it's something where, he was never really able to kind of acclimate to that. He was never really able to adapt to it. And it's something where, it ends up becoming, these end up becoming two of his greatest downfalls.
Yeah. And I think, look, it's obviously difficult to motivate somebody like Claude Giroux or Jake Voracek or Wayne Simmons when they've been there, done that for many years in the NHL, and here's this new guy who comes in from the college ranks, and like you said, these are grown men. These aren't kids who you're trying to motivate and trying to teach a lot too. I don't think that players like that feel like they need to be taught. They feel like they feel like they need to be guided a little bit. They need the leadership, but they don't need a guy to teach them anything. They've gotten to the NHL and they've played well in the NHL before this guy. So I think that comes into play for sure. Now, look, don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot of things, you can look back at Dave Hakstol's time too and go, why do we have Claude Giroux on the left wing here? Why are we talking about Claude Giroux playing left wing again? Because Dave Hakstol put him there, or at least with the help of Ron Hextall put him there. And that's a decision that I think will carry on for a little while. I think Giroux's looked better as a winger, and I think he feels more comfortable there now than he did at the start of last season. And look at what he did last season. And he's still your most consistent player on most nights when there's such a lack of it. So I think there's certain elements to Dave Hakstol that worked in the NHL. And look, I'm right there with you. I'm not going to say anything about him in terms of the way that his shortcomings were or anything like that. I didn't think he was a complete failure at the NHL level. You don't make the playoffs 2 times out of 3 years by being a complete failure. You also don't get players to have career years like he did without being, by being a complete failure. I don't think he's done at the NHL level, quite honestly. I don't think this is just go back to college at this point or something like that. I don't think he's done at the NHL level. I think he'll latch on to somebody else, and maybe he can latch on to another team, and another situation is going to be completely right for him. I don't think it was right for him in this particular city because it kind of transformed the way that the game was played. And the way that people were accustomed to seeing the team play. You didn't see that edge all the time. You saw them come out a little bit underprepared against some teams, especially in those years when they were making the playoffs. They would come out unprepared against teams that, with even just the minimal preparation, being somewhat ready for the game, you can probably beat those teams because they were that much lower than you in the standings. And that would not be the case in those situations at all. So that's where I think Dave Hakstol's shortcomings really piled up, was that lack of preparation, and kind of that's why I called it a little bit of a disconnect between the team and eventually I also say the fan base as well, but the team, because after a while a message gets stale and trying to play from behind. I believe that Claude Giroux's tired of telling people that it's got to get better from earlier in a game or earlier in a season. They've got to start off stronger. I think he's tired of saying stuff like that, because but you can't deny that that's the truth. So I don't think that Dave Hakstol's methods completely worked. I think they changed up a lot of things in terms of the style. You saw this team get passive at times, and that's never really been the style of the Flyers. So I think that that's going to change a lot now that you're going to probably bring in somebody who's even more willing to add some sandpaper to the game and really get this team to grind and go into the hard areas. I agree with Chuck Fletcher to an extent. I don't think that the team lacks any sort of heart or anything of that nature. I think when they really want to put it together, they'll put it together. I mean, I look at the third period against Buffalo at the start of that road trip that ended up being Dave Hakstol's downfall. I look at some of the other games this season. You look at the game against Arizona on home ice where they were trailing 4-2. They find a way to put that together. The game in Pittsburgh was a good example of this. And even Tuesday's game against Detroit, with everything that's gone on around this team, it's a good example of how they can come out and play for each other and play well. They are a tight-knit group. You can't deny that. So those are all things that stand out to me about this team in this state. And I think with Dave Hakstol, it just wasn't working anymore. There was a disconnect there. And there was a disconnect between the fan base, because the fan base is used to two things. They're used to a team playing hard, and they're used to a team that succeeds. And when that wasn't happening, especially over long stretches, Dave Hakstol was really right in the center of all of that, all of the attention that goes towards that, and all of the complaining that goes with that. So that's where I kind of think it went. I do want to shift over now to the next head coach. So let's talk about the next coach, at least for now, and that is Scott Gordon. And I think while being a part of the organization already means similar systems, I've always viewed Scott Gordon as an instructor, someone who is going to teach and help players learn from mistakes and guide players. Like I said, he's a coach that I think expects energy when a team plays. I think he tells it like it is when it comes to answering questions from the media and talking about the team. I think there's a lot to like about him. I think it's fair that he gets a chance to show he can do this job. I don't know that he's the right man for the job, but I would like to see what he can do. And I think that Gordon's familiarity with this team will go a long way. I think it's a great help to have Travis Sanheim, Oscar Lindblom, Robert Haig, even guys who didn't necessarily play for him in the AHL, like Travis Konechny, Ivan Provorov, Shane Gostisbehere, Nolan Patrick. It's great to have them be familiar with his style, his expectations, to fit the mold of the players he had previously coached as younger guys, and to get familiar with his style, his expectations, what he demands from his team on a regular basis. So with that, that's my thoughts on Scott Gordon. Rob, what are your thoughts on Scott Gordon taking over this job?
I mean, it's something where, you look at the amount of younger guys who have played for him in Lehigh Valley, guys like Oscar Lindblom, Travis Sanheim, Robert Haig, et cetera. I mean, it's something where, there is that familiarity there. I mean, it's obviously, and the important thing is that he is a new voice, and sometimes that's what you just need when you're a professional team. I mean, when the same things aren't working, he's a guy who can kind of come in, shake things up a little bit. He's that kind of dose of new blood. I mean, sometimes you just kind of need that kick in the pants. And, I think it's something where, it's actually, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I remember when back in 2013, when the Flyers fired Peter Laviolette, and they brought in Craig Berube, I was saying how, that was a smart move, because it's one of those things where there is that familiarity factor, but he could still provide a new voice at the same time. And yeah, they did make the playoffs that year, but when you look at how he just crashed and burned the next year, I mean, I was eating crow on that one. So it's one of those things where, it's a similar situation. It's not the same thing. You have a guy coming from the organization, just coming from a step down, and I mean, he's a guy who, he's coached at the NHL level before, and it's something where, it's one of those things where he can just kind of inject a new sort of lifeblood, and he can just kind of, figure out the best, ways to deploy, these guys out on the ice every night. And, it's something where, they're still, just figuring things out. And I mean, he's kind of, looking to, stick around a little bit, and, just, put talent to their best uses to get the best that he can out of them.
And one thing I didn't mention in the previous part of explaining all that or talking about Scott Gordon was the amount of success he's had at the AHL level with the Phantoms leading up to this point. To take a team that was missing the playoffs on a regular basis in the AHL to making the playoffs, to making a run. They were in the Eastern Conference Final last season. That can all be attributed to the way Scott Gordon handles developing young talent. And
He is ninth all-time in wins, is he not?
I'd
In the
have
AHL?
I'd have to check that. I didn't look that part up, but he's got the background of experience because he had 6 seasons coaching with Providence prior to any other experience that he had. I believe he had Providence first, then he coached the Islanders at the NHL. He was an assistant coach with Toronto for a few years, and then eventually made his way to the Flyers organization with the Phantoms. But I look at the way that team's played over the course of the last few years, and especially last season and the start of this season. It's a team that continues to have expectations to be a good team because of the number of prospects the Flyers have brought in. And I think Scott Gordon was tasked with something pretty big there, which is to make sure that these guys do experience some of that growth. The main part of the NHL team is dependent on those prospects eventually making some sort of an impact, especially with the way that Ron Hextall was building the team. So to get all those draft picks and prospects, to get them into the system, to get them on the Phantoms, to develop even more at a minor league level, it says a lot about what Gordon's able to do, that a number of them have been up at the NHL level. And that's what we're talking about with all these guys. We mentioned Gostisbehere and Haig and Lindblom and Sanheim and all those names. And eventually think about the guys that are to come also that will have had that experience too. And who knows when that time comes. We will obviously, like we said, we'll get into Carter Hart later, and Carter Hart played under Scott Gordon. Sam Moran is rehabbing to get back from an injury that was suffered late last season in the playoffs. And when he is able to play for the NHL team, that's another player who got years of experience under Scott Gordon. When the Flyers decide it's time to call up, say Phil Myers, pick, if you go among forwards, Nick Aube-Kubel, somebody like that. Those are guys who have years of experience under Scott Gordon and can probably relate to him, understand his systems, understand his expectations, and are able to respond to him. I do think one of the things I found very interesting when I was watching Tuesday's game, and it's something that no one is going to see unless you were there, because it happened during a TV timeout. So I'm up in the press box for Tuesday night's game. I'm watching, and during a TV timeout, during the third period, I believe, Scott Gordon's having a discussion with Chris Knobloch on the bench, and Knobloch turns around and reaches for the whiteboard, and no players were involved in this discussion at all. But the two of them are talking about something, and they're drawing something up. They're talking strategy. They're talking positioning. It's basically system talk in a way, without necessarily putting it in front of the team. It's almost like Scott Gordon was using some of that time also as an observation period. Let me see how this team plays and where I can make adjustments. And it would be something interesting to see if in the next game and the games that follow, if those things take shape over time. The team didn't have a practice on Wednesday, which is a little unique, but at the same time, they had played 2 games back-to-back over the weekend on Friday and Saturday that led to the decision to fire Dave Hakstol. They flew home on Sunday, a cross-country flight from Vancouver to Philadelphia. So that was a travel day completely. There was nothing to do there with that. And Monday, the team practices while all this other stuff around the organization is going on, and then plays a game on Tuesday. So after all of that, maybe you just give him a little mental reset here, come back Thursday for a morning skate, be fresh, be ready to go, and be ready to play one of the best teams in the NHL. That's that's not an understatement there. But I look at Scott Gordon and I think that he's worth a fair shot. I kind of speculated at one point in time when we thought, long before we had candidates lined up, people who we knew had been previously fired by their teams that were out there as free agents. We had this conversation probably, or it was mentioned a year ago when the team was going on a 10-game losing streak, that maybe Dave Hakstol needs to be the one who bites the dust as a result of this. Maybe he's the scapegoat for a team not performing and a team not coming out with any sense of life to it or urgency to correct the situation. And if and when that would have happened, I think the only option at that time would have been to promote Scott Gordon. There really wasn't anybody out there who was available at that given moment to be brought on by an NHL team, or at least anybody who was as attractive as some of the names are out there right now. So those things all factor in. So I don't think there's anything unnatural or unexpected about Scott Gordon taking over this team. I think that he's got a shot to do some pretty impressive things with this team, and he's tasked with trying to make them competitive. Sure, he's tasked with trying to help them win games, and got off to a good start with that on Tuesday. But he's tasked with just trying to get this team to play more consistently. I loved what he had to say about breakouts after the game on Tuesday. His post-game comments and talking about breakouts and defensemen moving the puck and players moving the puck up ice. And if you have the ice in front of you, go ahead and make the play. And if you don't, it's okay to not force the play and wait for the next shift. You'll get another shift, and maybe it'll happen then, but don't force it. And you saw the Flyers have cleaner zone exits as a result of that in Tuesday's game. It was much more polished, much crisper than what it was beforehand. It was where it kind of needs to be. It's a good starting point for this team to build some confidence about the way they can move the puck and the way they can communicate with each other and play together a little bit, because I think that was lacking when Dave Hakstol was still part of this team. Now, obviously, we can talk about Scott Gordon for a big chunk of the show here and talk about his expectations and his future, but realistically, we're still getting to know that. And I do think that one of the things that I will say about what Chuck Fletcher had to say about making Scott Gordon the coach for the time being is that he's not putting a timeline on it. The expectation is it could last the rest of the season. It may not, but you never know that. I do think at the very least it allows this team to kind of go into the holidays. The roster freeze happens Wednesday night at midnight, so there's a lot of things that kind of hold status quo for a while. They get to play Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday. And in all three of those games, no, there's nothing that's really going to be crazy happening. They go on 3 days of a break. They go on the road after that for 4 more games into the new year. So you got some time before something kind of drastic happens. So Scott Gordon's going to get a few weeks, probably at least a month or two, I would say, to be safe before any thoughts of anything come into play. But we really don't know that. All that being said, there are names out there, and let's face it, as of Sunday night, it was believed that Joel Quenneville was going to be named the next head coach of the Flyers. There's nothing that says that isn't still possible, but it isn't going to happen anytime soon. Chuck Fletcher said he hasn't spoken directly with Quenneville in over 2 years. There has been no contact between Quenneville and the Flyers, and yet the majority believe this is who the Flyers want and who they should go after. I think a lot of that is on Quenneville. Does he want to be coaching again right now in this moment? He got fired earlier in the year. Maybe he wants the rest of the season off and can return after that. He's getting paid by the Chicago Blackhawks $6 million this year and next year to do nothing because they fired him. So why would he want to jump back into things if he's enjoying some time off? I do still think that that's the coach the Flyers need down the road. They need a guy with that NHL pedigree, that track record that can put the Flyers over the top to make them a true contender again. But I don't know that we'll hear anything regarding coaching for, like I said, for at least the next month or so, and if not at the end of the season. And one of the things about Joel Quenneville that I'd bring up too is I don't know that I want to see another coach behind the bench so soon while I'm kind of trying to figure out what this team is. There's nowhere to hide anymore, and I think the players realize that the GM's gone, the coach is gone, and the next thing that's going to be gone, if any more changes are made, are the players. So I think they realize that, and it's time to kind of determine who you have that is possibly available in a trade, the areas you can try to look for other options to fill in some holes. Goaltending is still one of them to an extent because you never know when you're going to be thrown into a situation again. And right now, it seems pretty apparent that they don't feel like they can completely trust Michael Neuvert, which is why Carter Hart's getting starts. But otherwise, and Alex Lyon getting sent to the minors for Carter Hart tells you an awful lot about what they think there. And Brian Elliott and Anthony Stolarz are out for at least weeks. So they may still try to address that situation defensively. They could always use a veteran presence back there to go along with some of these other players, somebody who's much more established and skilled than Andrew McDonald or Radko Gudas. Nothing against their roles, but they are somebody who's got a higher ceiling than that. And, even at forward, if you can add another pure scorer, if you can add a guy who's a little bit of an elite playmaker in that regard, go for it, but don't force anything. That's the thing. And they'll look at all avenues and all options, and all players could be. I think the point is just to make sure that everybody knows no player is untouchable at this point, I would think, just because the team has enough flaws and enough areas where they can improve, where everything and anything and everything is going to be on the table. But Rob, I would like to get your thoughts as well. If it's not Quenneville in this moment at this moment, do you think it will be at some point?
I think it's one of those things where, like you mentioned, I mean, is Quenneville going to be in a hot hurry to get back behind the bench? I mean, like you said, the man's getting paid $6 million to kind of just sit around and do nothing. I think realistically, the only thing that will get Quenneville behind the bench is just the fact that he's such a competitor. His competitive spirit. We were talking about this on Sunday, where guys like Joel Quenneville, he's a rare breed where he's a guy that always wants to win. Those 3 Stanley Cups that he won in Chicago, that's not enough for him. He wants to go get more. And it's something where, like we've seen with Rick Wilson coming to the Flyer staff and Ken Hitchcock coming out of retirement to take the job at Edmonton. It's one of those things where, those are guys that they have that competitive fire, and that's really the thing, putting them back behind the bench. And it's something where I think Chuck Fletcher also wants to kind of nip any kind of distraction in the bud. I mean, like once he took over, he did come out and say that Dave Hakstol was going to have an evaluation period, but it's one of those things where when it comes down to it, I mean, it was a distraction at the end of the day. I mean, it's something where the rest of the team. I mean, everybody knew that Dave Hakstol was a dead man walking, and it's one of those things where if the players weren't tuning him out before then, that they were just anything that he had to say was just in one ear and out the other at that point. Something did need to be done. There was just that distraction, kind of looming over. And I think Fletcher, it was one of those things. It was inevitable. It was going to happen, and it's something where I think Fletcher wants to kind of nip that in the bud this time around as well. He wants to kind of take it, to use the old hockey cliche, one step at a time out there. And it's something where, he wants to, just kind of see how, Scott Gordon does, if he is able to bring in Joel Quenneville. I mean, it's something where, it could be, the goal down the line, but I think he just wants to kind of avoid the distraction of, oh, we're getting a new coach anyway, so there's no point in seeing what this guy's got to say.
Yeah, and well, look, and Joel Quenneville, to everyone's knowledge, is skiing in Colorado as at the moment. So you can kind of see how he's enjoying some time off. I
$6 million to ski in Colorado.
To ski in Colorado, to go and hang out at a Chicago Bears tailgate, things like that. He's kind of living it up since all this has happened.
It's like the Seinfeld episode with the summer of George. This is the winter of Joel.
For sure. I will say this. Look, if Joel Quenneville wants this job, I don't think anybody's going to deny him the job here. I think it comes down to when he wants to take the reins over for any team. If he's interested in getting back, I'm with you. I don't see how the competitive fire dies in somebody just because it was we're talking about the end of an era with Dave Hakstol being fired by the Flyers. It was an end of an era in Chicago when Joel Quenneville was fired, especially when you consider all the history, the 3 Stanley Cups. So that's the end of an era. Maybe you take a little bit of time to reflect on that, to think about how it finished up, to examine the hunger for achieving that success again. And I don't think that goes away. I mean, there's a reason Ken Hitchcock is doing this again. And there's a reason Rick Wilson came back to be an assistant coach for the Flyers. It doesn't go away. You want to keep going, and you want to keep being part of the game more than just being a spectator. I do think that Joel Quenneville's enjoying the idea of being a little bit of a spectator right now, but give him the rest of the year, give him a couple of months, whatever it may be, maybe give him through the holidays. I don't think that you'll see a change that much, but I do believe that in some capacity, they're going to look to try to find a way to kind of get him to be a part of this team in some way, shape, or form, until this decision time comes, whenever it may be. I thought it was notable because we keep talking about the things, or not the things that were said, but we talk about Dave Hakstol and the voice kind of fading out at this point, and it's not being received. The message isn't being received anymore. It's going in one ear out the other. He was kind of a dead man walking the whole nine, right? And I thought it was very telling that Chuck Fletcher talked about the Calgary game a lot during the press conference, mentioning that the Calgary game was one that you have to lock it down. The fact that they didn't lock it down, the fact that it felt like the way that they didn't lock it down too, not playing to not managing the puck well, not managing the game situation well, turning the puck over. Those are things that stood out to Chuck Fletcher. And I give Chuck Fletcher a little bit of credit if that's where this decision took him, or if that's where this observation took him, because he was, it was only 2 weeks ago that he sat there at his introductory press conference and talked about how through the course of those first games, there was 1 game on home ice and then 5 games on the road. And the idea was that he was going to use those games as an evaluation period to get to understand what the team needs and where they need to be going. And in 6 games time, through watching a couple of those games and the way they happened, the way they played out, he came to a conclusion pretty quickly. Now, I don't know if there was any more involvement from upper management that, would help make that decision for him a little easier or have some input. But I do think that I don't think it really matters. I think everybody could see what was happening. The writing was starting to be on the wall there for Dave Hakstol. And I think that, you go to that Calgary game and the way that game ends, 2 goals in the final minute, 8 seconds to force overtime, then 35 seconds into overtime, Johnny Gaudreau scores and the game's over, and you lost a point that really you should have always had from the beginning because you were up by 2 goals with under 90 seconds to go. You've got to lock it down. And, to the team's credit, that was exactly the thing I thought they did in Tuesday's game, was in playing with a lead, 1 goal lead late, you played the situation the way you need to play. You didn't give up too many chances to allow that tying goal. Detroit pushed, but you didn't give up too many chances. And look, maybe Detroit didn't have their best game on Tuesday night, and it was not the type of effort that Detroit wants to have against a rookie goalie in his first game and against a team that should be pretty fragile from all the involvement and all the happenings going on around the team in the last 24 hours. But, sometimes that happens to any team. You just don't have it on a given night. And the other team, the job that for the team that was in the Flyers position like they were last night is to take advantage of that situation. If a team's not coming out with their best, then bring your best or whatever you think you can and try to turn that into your success here, and into a victory. So I do think that, I think that when it comes to the coaching, a new voice was necessary, whether it was Scott Gordon or Joel Quenneville. I don't think it matters. And I think that Quenneville is still the guy that they're going to target. There's other names out there. And I think if we're going to talk about other names, I think that other names depends on their situations. Mike Yeo's available, and there's obviously a history between Yeo and Chuck Fletcher, but I don't think that that's the guy the Flyers want. I don't think that's the guy, I think Mike Yeo is very comparable to Scott Gordon in a sense that I think that he can be the guy who can try to get a lot out of younger players, but maybe can't get them across the finish line. So I think Scott Gordon could do as good of a job as Mike Yeo could of trying to get some younger players to play to their strengths and to improve on their weaknesses. But I don't think that he's the guy who's going to finish the job. So I think Quenneville's a guy for sure. And then if you're going to try to play that card where it's a guy who's younger, who maybe can develop, but also can try to take advantage of a situation, I think a dark horse in this whole conversation should this, and it's kind of contingent on it getting to the end of the season because he is another team's property at the moment. But I think Sheldon Keefe, the AHL coach in Toronto, is another name that will come up over time, depending on how quickly something happens. I think Joel Quenneville's the name that the Flyers want and that everybody else would want around that supports this team. But I think that if you're looking for a dark horse candidate, somebody who is out there, whose name has been thrown around in terms of head coaching jobs before, who becomes more of a candidate to me the longer this goes on, then of course, unless Joel Quenneville's whole deal here is he wants the time off, and when he's done, he's more than willing to take this job, and that's who they're going to offer it to. Okay, fine. But I believe that Sheldon Keefe is a outside option here, a dark horse candidate, if this gets toward the end of the season or into the offseason and they try to evaluate the whole situation here. So I think that's another guy who is a candidate and, somebody else to watch for as well. And like I said, Mike Yeo's available, Todd McClellan's available, but you're not hearing a whole lot about those guys, and John Stevens is another one who's still available. But again, you're not hearing much about those guys. I don't think the Flyers would go kind of backtrack to John Stevens. that's kind of bringing in an old chapter, if you will. And I don't think like I said, I don't think that Mike Yeo is the guy that the Flyers would go to, or that Chuck Fletcher would go to. There is history there, but I don't think that's where it's going to go. And McClellan to me just doesn't seem like, if I had if you had the choice between McClellan or Quenneville, then you're going to take Quenneville every time probably. And that's not a knock against Todd McClellan. It's just that Quenneville's got such a Hall of Fame resume that if it's available, you're going to pick that guy. And I think that that's where this is eventually going to head, unless Scott Gordon really comes in and proves that he's a guy who can lead this team beyond this season and be that guy. But we'll have to wait and see. Now, let's talk about the debut of Scott Gordon behind the bench and the debut of Carter Hart in goal, because certainly it was a different look for the Flyers. When something like this happens, it's noticeable and there's a buzz about it. To be honest, in my evaluation of Tuesday's game, I thought the Flyers handled it well. I thought they got off to a good start. They withstood some of the push from Detroit that was going to happen. The team's going to push back after a bit of a slow start. The Flyers did get the first goal. They took a lead into the first intermission. Those are all positives. There were moments, but I think this team played with a greater sense of urgency. One, because you have a 20-year-old kid in goal. Look, he could turn out to be a generational talent. He could be a Patrick Waugh type. And I'm not comparing Carter Hart to Patrick Waugh, but I'm trying to say is you could have Patrick Waugh in goal, and even at 20 years old, and you don't want to leave that kid out to dry like they have in other games for other goalies. You don't want to do that in his NHL debut. Two, as I mentioned earlier, I think is that the onus is on the players now to step up and perform, or there will be more changes to come. I still believe that there should be more changes to this lineup because there are flaws and there are cracks in the chemistry, I think. But if the players can't make it work now, then it will never work because you've tried everything. You've swapped GMs to see if somebody else from an outside perspective can see ways to improve this roster. You've changed coaches. And now that you've changed coaches, it's a different voice coaching this team, which should produce different results. And if it doesn't, then it becomes a player issue. So the team is going to change more because of that if they can't make it work, because if they can't make it work now, then it will never work. So this is kind of, like I said, I think another 2-week audition. The roster freezes at midnight on Wednesday. The team in its current state will play the next 4 games like this, at least be on the road for 3 more after that. This is another series of auditions over a stretch. I want to go to Carter Hart because when this let me say right off the bat here, when this move was announced, I hated this decision. Don't get me wrong. I think Carter Hart is a capable goalie. He's going to be a starter in the NHL, and his potential is through the roof. All positives with this kid. That being said, his development was taking strides in the right direction, and his confidence was growing at the AHL level. Why is that? He had won 4 of the previous 5 games he had played with the Phantoms. He was playing better. That helps the results, and winning games like that can boost you in the right direction. So with that in mind, I really thought he should stay in the minors and stay in there for kind of the long haul for the season, because it was going to improve his mindset for when the NHL came calling. Now, granted, as of Sunday night, the Flyers were heading in the direction of, I don't want to kind of go there with this because you don't want to say that this is what they're doing, but it's heading in the direction of this being a throwaway season, a season where you're not going to climb out of that hole that you've established early in the year. The team's in shambles. There's no sense of structure. You've changed everything about management, so it's a completely clean slate. Do you really want a 20-year-old kid to play behind a team that's kind of in shambles and trying to regather its sense of structure? Now, there is a follow-up to that. In being completely opposed to giving him such an early call as he finds his confidence in the AHL, I did think about Carter Hart, the person. I've spoken to him before at training camp. We've watched him play on the largest stage in World Juniors. Playing for Team Canada is a tough task when it comes to World Juniors. The nation lives off of that kind of stuff because they take any opportunity to support the nation's team, whether that's an Olympic team, World Juniors, World Championships. It doesn't matter. They live for that. We've watched him be the best player in the WHL and the best goalie in junior hockey for the last 2+ years. So if anyone was going to have the confidence and the mentality to do this now, to take this shot, maybe run with it, it's going to be this kid. His first game wasn't spectacular. It's not something that's off the charts, but the Flyers did a really nice job of keeping a lot of chances away from him in making 20 saves. I can probably think of 5 or 6 that were very noteworthy and truly test a netminder, no matter what their experience is. Jonathan Bernier was at the other end, and that's a guy with a lot of experience, a veteran in this league. And some of the shots that Carter Hart faced in his first game would have tested Jonathan Bernier the same way. He made one big stop in the first period before the Flyers scored the first goal of the game to preserve a scoreless game at that point. So that was a big one. He made 2 big saves at the end of the second period, both with the pad. And then down the stretch in the third period, he made 2 more saves that I think preserved the win. And I don't know that the quality of saves matters near as much as the calmness in which you play. If you stay calm, you stay focused, and you do the task at hand, you'll win a good amount of the time. I thought he did that. So, look, while I'm still skeptical of Carter Hart's call-up, the timing of this, and the way the team looks in front of him and can play in front of him, like I said, let me be clear. I don't doubt Carter Hart's abilities at all. I think he already looked like the best goalie on the roster out of training camp, but obviously there was a step that needed to be taken in his development. And let's face it, Hart was all right in those first few games in the AHL. It was over the last 5 that he really started to meet the hype and deliver the numbers that people were accustomed to seeing when he was in juniors. And now in Philadelphia, he's got everyone's support and he's got such a good head on his shoulders. And look, by winning his first game, he showed that he can do it at this level. It's just a matter of how he handles a game that looks different from this. So, Rob, your thoughts on Carter Hart, the debut, and the decision to bring him up?
Not unlike you, Kevin, I wasn't the biggest fan of the decision to call him up. I didn't want to see him wear the orange and black at all this year. I wanted him to have a full season in the AHL. Let him get that seasoning that he needs. It is his first professional season. There's a whole lot going on. There's a lot of hype surrounding him, and it's one of those things where you don't want to throw too much at the kid too quickly. It's something where it's a situation where there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of growth and development. You kind of want it to be a season where he just kind of learns the ropes. The professional scope, the professional competition is significantly different than it is in juniors. And you look at how accomplished he was with the Everett Silvertips. It's one of those things where that's one of my favorite names for a hockey team, by the way. But it's one of those things that it's something where there's a lot of adjustments that Carter Hart was going to have to make to his game. It's something where that there was a lot that he was going to have to be working on. There's a lot for him to learn, and it's one of those things where I wanted to have him get that full season in the AHL just to kind of learn the ropes and kind of adjust to the rigors of it all. And that being said, you knew that. That the Flyers, it's a goalie carousel for them right now for all the wrong reasons. Just because everybody going down with injury. Brian Elliott being injured, Michael Neuwirth being injured. Stop me if you heard that one before. Anthony Stolar's getting injured, and it's one of those things where it's just they have not had any luck whatsoever at the goaltending position. It's just so many factors at play. I mean, it's one of those things that. He was. It seemed like he was going to be, called into it sooner rather than later, and it's, that it was their 32nd game, and Carter Hart was their 6th goalie of the season. And, a lot of people made a big deal about that on the national level, where it's the Flyers already have 5 goalies playing for him this season. Well, it's something where it just no luck for them whatsoever, and it's one of those things where Carter Hart ends up being called in just to kind of be that breath of fresh air. And it's one of those things where as much as I didn't like the decision to call him up, I mean I liked getting him in there against Detroit, against the Red Wings. It's one of those things where the Red Wings obviously it's no longer the days of the dominant Detroit teams from the late 90s and the 2000s decade. I mean, it's something where they're a rebuilding club in their own right as well. And, they entered that game. I think they were only 5 points ahead of the Flyers in the standings. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows up in Hockey Town. It's something where it's a rough year for them. But it's something where at least he was able. And I don't want to say I don't want to downplay what Carter Hart did against the Red Wings. I mean, he did look pretty decent. against Detroit. I mean, you can say, only 20 saves, but it's one of those things where, he was looking polished, he was looking sharp, he was looking decent. And, it's something where, when you look at it, I mean, the downside is that, as good as he did look then, I mean, do you want to put him back out there against, a top team in Nashville? I mean, that's a much bigger challenge, and it's something where, even if it's not that, you still have a back-to-back this weekend with Columbus and the Rangers. So it's something where, do you want to get him going against those teams? I mean, it's certainly uh, a real Sophie's choice. I mean, it's something where, you know, uh, he did look good in his debut. I mean, you can hope he can kind of, build the momentum. I mean, you also remember several years ago when Shane Gostisbehere was called up for his first full season, and he was able to parlay that into a Calder Trophy nomination. I mean, he had an unparalleled start. I mean, nobody expected him to kind of break out the way that he did, but that's also one of those long shot kind of deals. I mean, people, I think that's something that's at the back of everybody's mind. Can Carter Hart do something similar? But it's one of those things where the odds aren't that great. I mean, if he's able to look good at the NHL level, then that's a conversation for another day. As much as I didn't like the decision to call him up, I mean, it's something that he's looked good, and obviously the sample size is small, but we'll see where he goes from here.
Yeah, and I mean, like we talked about with the way the roster is too, and the roster freeze that's going to happen. He's going to be here for Thursday and the weekend, and a little bit of a stretch beyond that, obviously too. So, one thing I'll say about Scott Gordon more than Dave Hakstol, I thought Dave Hakstol always used to have an issue with playing the hot hand a little too much. Not that there's anything wrong with playing a goalie who's on a roll, but to ride a goalie to the point where you would almost bury him into the ground, and that's how you lead to injuries to goalies who play a lot. Like, I looked at that last game on Saturday against Vancouver, and I didn't think that Anthony Stolarz, as good as he had played previously, had any business being in that game after playing all the games he did earlier. It was a back-to-back. There was really no sense in throwing him out there. And then, sure enough, 10 minutes into the game, he's already coming out with an injury. You kind of set yourself up for that one. It's kind of funny. One of the thoughts that came to my head as I'm watching Carter Hart make his NHL debut, and even leading up to it, was kind of as that news broke, and then he's going to start and he's going to make his debut. And one of my first thoughts was, I wonder what Ron Hextall is thinking right now. I wonder what Ron Hextall is thinking about this kid being up here making his debut at a time when he never in a million years would have made this call at this time. I don't think that the kid is here to collect dust on the bench like they've done with other goalies in the past. He's here to get a shot to play. So if I had to guess, I would think he's going to play against Nashville just because why not? He didn't do anything in Tuesday's game that takes away from the confidence in being able to put him out there against a better team. You got to give him a shot somewhere in there. So I think that that'll happen. I think he'll get one of the games in the back-to-back for sure, but whether it's the Columbus game on home ice or the Ranger game on the road. And then, again, you've got 4 games on the road that carry you into the new year, and I think he gets at least 2 of those as well. So I think he's here to play, and I think he's going to probably, in short order here, probably have 4 or 5 starts to his name before you know it. So I'm prepared to see him in goal on Thursday. I'm prepared to possibly see him in goal on Saturday, I would say. I kind of weigh back and forth on whether I think that the Ranger game or the Columbus game is the better one for him. The Columbus game's on home ice, so he'll have the fan support. I mean, the fans went crazy on Tuesday night when he played the puck. It wasn't even something that qualifies as a save, but if he played the puck because it rolled in on goal, they were cheering for him like crazy. So he's got the support of the fan base right now, and that's always a good thing to have in his corner, more than putting him in a game in Madison Square Garden against the Rangers. I think that maybe you could play him against Columbus and get that, home support on his side, especially since he'll have to play a road game here sooner or later. So maybe you get him a few home games to get a feel for the NHL level and the speed of the game and the players that he's going to be facing, he'll face some good ones against Nashville. He'll face players who know what to do when they get the puck on their stick and to try to do it. Now, granted, Nashville is a little beat up right now, so he's not going to face superstars like Victor Arvidsson and Philip Forsberg or PK Subban, but you'll face good players and you're going to have to make some good saves. So we'll see how he looks in that game if he's the guy who's going to get the call. There was no practice on Wednesday, so we really have no indications of where it's going to go until they take the morning skate on Thursday. All that being said, let's just see what the kid has. I talked about running with an opportunity, and I think about the same situation you did, Rob, where you look at what Shane Gostisbehere did when he got a call for good and came up, played his game, played to an incredibly high level, and it turned into a Calder Trophy nomination. I'm not saying that Carter Hart's going to be up for the Calder, but what I'm saying is that when an opportunity strikes, a goalie or any player for that matter is going to try to take advantage. And if he really rolls with this opportunity, he's got a shot to really make an impact with this team. So that's where I kind of leave it. And I'm curious to see how often he gets into games and what the course is from here. But when you think about the rest of the Flyers goalie situation, you understand why he's up. There really weren't many other ways to turn unless you were going to somehow find somebody to sign, for next to nothing, who wasn't going to be, who was really going to be a placeholder until somebody came back. So you might as well give this kid his shot right now. That's probably the way, it may not be the best timing, but let's let the kid tell us if he's ready to go or not. Let's let Carter Hart tell us that he's ready or not. So we'll leave it up to that and kind of evaluate more as the season progresses here and however long he's up for. We're just about ready to wrap things up. And again, we appreciate everybody who's tuning in to this sort of special edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast. It's been, we obviously, like we said, we were just on Sunday talking about the possibility that there was a coaching change in the works. There was no confirmation. There was no indication that we were getting, we weren't getting any information on Sunday night that it was that was definitive. And we found out pretty early on Monday afternoon that this was going to happen, that there was a coaching change being made. Dave Hakstol was out. Scott Gordon was taking over on an interim basis, and Carter Hart was coming up as well. So all those things happening, and we felt the need to come back on and talk about that as well, to put especially as we, when we enter into the new year, we wanted to put a bow on any of the major changes. The fact that the GM's been changed, the fact that the coach is now changed, and assuming that we'll get through and into the new year before anything else were to happen with this team that's significant, whether it be a trade or a full-time coach being hired whenever they decide to do that and decide that coaching search is over. All that being said, we appreciate the people who are listening to this, who heard our voices earlier this week and are willing to tune back in to get our thoughts on the change, the new interim head coach, and the new goaltender that the Flyers have pulled from the minors as well. The really long-awaited arrival of Carter Hart and the arrival of Scott Gordon as well. So as we get ready to wrap this up, Rob, do you have any final thoughts as we get ready to send it off and sign off for the rest of the calendar year here?
Yeah, I am kind of curious to see where they go from here. I mean, the changes are coming. I mean, Chuck Fletcher's been willing to shake things up so far, and it feels like he's not done just yet. And I'm kind of curious. I mean, it feels like there's a new dawn for Philadelphia Flyers hockey. It's something that you don't experience very often, and there's it's interesting. I'm intrigued, and I'm kind of curious to see where this one goes.
It's funny that you said it the way that you did, because I'm actually going to put a column on the website tomorrow, I believe. So Thursday morning, for those of you who are listening on Thursday morning, if you are listening later in the week or the weekend, it was out on Thursday. But my idea of this whole situation and perceiving the situation is that it's a clean slate for the Flyers now. You've changed everything from a management standpoint: new GM, new head coach. The players are still the same, but anything's subject to change when you have a new leadership at the top and new leadership behind the bench. So with it being kind of a clean slate, it's a new era. This is a new era, and I think it's even more of a new era now that Carter Hart's part of the picture, at least for now. You're opening doors here to what this team could look like in the future. The players may certainly be different after a year, but this is now the GM who's going to try to complete the task and get them to the playoffs and get them into contention for a Stanley Cup and maybe to a Stanley Cup final in a few years. And maybe Scott Gordon's not the coach long term, but it's the start of it. That there's an evaluation process for Gordon. There's a thought process and a search behind the possibility of the next full-time head coach of this team. So all those things in play.
I'll tell you something else. We didn't even have time to get to it on this edition of the podcast, but you and I we've been following this team for a long time, Kevin, and the one thing it's never been for the most part is boring, and it's something where there's all sorts of stuff going on, all sorts of changes being made, but the one thing that's it's kind of an under the radar thing, but they have a player on the roster, Jori Lehtera, who is set to stand trial for basically being an international drug kingpin, and it's something where it's getting no play because of all these changes that are being made, all these wholesale changes. It's wild in a sense. I mean, where else are you going to see something like that where a player is getting set to stand trial for a drug bust, and it's something where it's getting next to no play just because of everything else that is going on with them. It's absolutely wild. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in my time as a sports fan.
Well, and to top it off too, I actually thought about that because my thought was, remember when we thought that story was going to kind of just disappear after a while? They denied it, then it disappeared. He played a few games, the whole deal, and it's like, what a time for that to pop back up in the middle of all this, because it does fly right under the radar and no one's talking about that. So
it's because when it originally went down, it was the same week that they unveiled Gritty.
Yeah, that's right.
So Jori Lehtera is either incredibly he's a guy who somehow manages to avoid the news cycle at all costs.
Yeah, right. Well, anyway, I do agree with you that it is a dawn of a new era for this team, and we'll kind of see who's in charge of that new era moving forward. Chuck Fletcher's certainly going to be in charge of it, but for right now, it's Scott Gordon, and it could be somebody different in another month, maybe in a couple months, maybe at the end of the year. Who knows? But we'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of interesting things going on with this team, and and to an extent, exciting. New beginnings are exciting. I totally get that it's a team that's in last place in the Eastern Conference and a team that's, or at least was until the win on Tuesday. And it's a team that's far from the playoff picture, even though they're not that far by the numbers. Performance-wise would indicate otherwise, All that being said, it's still an exciting time because everybody wants, you want to see Carter Hart. That's what the fans want to see. It draws people's attention. I think the fans were satisfied with anybody who wasn't Dave Hakstol being the head coach. And while I never like hearing chants like that and anything like that, because it's a business and it's a professional setting, and we handle ourselves. Rob and I have both done it where we've gone and we've handled it. We have to handle ourselves as professionals. Where even when a situation may not be the most ideal, we saw the writing on the wall too. But you can't just come out all hostile and go, they've got to fire this guy. We don't talk like that. We look at the evaluation process too, and think about where if you thought about areas where the team could improve, preparation was one, communication and game management was another, and all of those things apply when it comes to making a coaching change for Dave Hakstol. So when the fact that there's a new voice kind of takes away the ire of the fans a little bit, maybe draws them back in a little bit too, to see what this team can do. I think Tuesday's game was easily one of the best of the season, just from a standpoint of excitement, because as you were watching the end of that game, who wasn't pulling for the situation at that point? It's a 1-goal game. You wanted Carter Hart to finish off his first NHL win, and he does. And the moment was great for him as a 20-year-old to be this young guy, the youngest goalie in franchise history to win his NHL debut. There's a lot of excitement around that. So it's going to be an interesting rest of 2018. And then when we cross over into 2019, we'll certainly be back to look at the situation and even more and see where this team is and kind of go from there. So that is going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We do want to thank everyone for listening again. Be sure to subscribe to the Flyerdelphia Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, remember to check us out on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly podcast network. Remember, you can listen to us and shows on the rest of the Philly sports scene through the podcast network. The Phillies Nation podcast covering Phillies Nation podcast on Sports Talk Philly covering the Phillies, the Pick Swap pod covering the Sixers, and the Kelly Green Boys covering the Eagles. We can now say with probable certainty, I'll say it that way, that this is our final episode before the holidays and for 2018. Assuming something crazy doesn't happen, and with the roster freeze, there's really no room for anything crazy to happen. So we feel pretty safe about telling you we will be back in the new year and done for the rest of this calendar year. We weren't completely sure of that earlier this week, and sure enough, there was more to talk about before we wrapped up for the year. So again, we do appreciate everybody who's listening to us again, kind of for the second time in a week. It's a little bit of a emergency podcast, if you will, to try to throw in an episode about the coaching change before we wrapped for the year. So with this being the final episode of the year and us firmly knowing it, we want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year to all of our listeners. We've certainly had a lot of fun this year talking Flyers hockey and sharing that with you through all the ups and downs of this team. We do enjoy sharing it with you, and we will see you again in 2019. So once again, thank you for tuning in. For Rob Riches, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heeney.